For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to raise a question of personal privilege.
The chair has been made aware of a valid basis for the gentleman's point of personal privilege. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Appreciate being recognized here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And throughout the years, I've had the privilege to serve Iowans and Americans here. This is a great deliberative body, although sometimes we miss the facts. And I know that there's a phrase that I heard back in the in a political era, which is whenever you lose a vote, you can sometimes use this analysis. Nor is the people's judgment always true. The most can err as grossly as the few. And that has happened a number of times in my 18 years that I've served in this Congress. This is the 116th Congress. And if someone were to ask me, well, what was your favorite session of Congress? I don't have to worry about the 116th being on that list. But I rise to focus on a specific circumstance here, and that is a misquote of me that was driven into just a national feeding frenzy. It was validated by this Congress, this misquote. And when I stood on the floor of this Congress and made a statement to describe what likely happened in an interview with the New York Times that took place in early January of 2019, I made the point on what that statement was. And the statement was regarding white nationalists, white supremacists. There always was a pause between those two odious ideologies and the term Western civilization. I advised the Congress that there would be a distinct pause to demonstrate a new thought started rather than jamming those three ideologies together. Who would compare white nationalism and white supremacy as the odious ideologies? Who would compare them to Western civilization, the very foundation of the American civilization, the foundation of the first world, and here America, the flagship of Western civilization today? There is no comparison and should never be equated between the two. Yet, I didn't tie that thought together, but the stenographers did. And I'm not here to be a critic because they've done terrific work for me over the years. And their skill sets and their professionalism is second to none. They're the best in the world as far as I'm concerned. But if they can make a mistake, so can the New York Times, which is my point. And so in this narrative, Madam Speaker, I'll take you back a little ways. And I want the Congress to know what all has transpired here that brought us to the point of the feeding frenzy and the political lynch mob that was here that day on about the 12th or so or 13th of January. And it was this, that during my election in the year 2018, November 2018, there was a national media focus on attacking me. That happens in other races, but I don't know that it ever happened as intensively as it did in my race. In any case, we came through that with a 3.4% victory. And I thought that was the end of it. I expected that I would come back. Even your political opposition needs a rest from time to time. And so after the election is when they take a deep breath, retool, and get ready for the legislative session. But I sat down with a political operative who was one of the top political campaign managers at the presidential level in the nation, and a successful one at that. He came in to seek give me a little bit of his advice. And as I'm listening to that, he said, they're going to try again. They're going to try again to drive you out of office with a national media assault on you, and they're going to attack you with everything they can. They'll throw everything at you. He didn't say but the kitchen sink, but I got the message. And when he first brought that up, Mr. Speaker, when he first brought that up, I passed it off because I didn't take it seriously. Nothing like that had ever happened before in the history of this country that I knew. And he brought it up a second time, and I passed it off again because I didn't take it seriously. But the third time, he got my attention. And the third time he brought it up, he said, they're going to make another run at you. This was the day before Thanksgiving of 2018, by the way. He said they're going to make another run at you, and they believe that they were this meaning Democrats, yes, but also Republicans, establishment, the swamp creatures, the elitists, those folks, and also the media. They're going to make another run because they believe that the midterm elections of 2018 were a bit distracting. They had other races to be concerned about, and so therefore they couldn't bring all their guns to bear on this member of Congress from the 4th District of Iowa. And so he did have my attention by then. And as much as it didn't seem plausible, his advice to me was this: they have a messenger that they will send to the president, a messenger whom the president trusts and who has his ear, who's going to be directed to convince the president to send out a negative tweet on Congressman King, and that negative tweet will be the trigger that launches another media assault, all the broadsides that they can get on this member of Congress. And he used these words: and they believe they can force you to resign. Now, that's a hard concept to get into your head when nothing like that had ever happened before, and there was no substance for that to be based upon. But he did convince me. And so I set about preempting this at his advice, and I did, to the extent I could, preempted it at the White House. And I think history proves that that has been successful. President Trump has not taken a shot at me, even though there were many others who couldn't resist the press's temptation to take a cheap shot. But the president did not. And so I take it that the effort to preempt it at the White House was at least partially successful. And yet the messenger, I couldn't get a meeting with the messenger until January 8th, 2019. So on January 8th, I had that meeting with the person that was at least named as the potential messenger. And in that conversation, I was assured I would never do that to you, Steve. Be assured that that won't happen. Well, I was fairly confident that those words were honest, and I actually felt pretty happy about it when I walked out of that meeting. But I also suspected that the people that were around that individual might find out about the meeting that I had just finished and might know that I understood the gambit that was going to be run against me. And that was January 8th. January 9th, amazingly, I have a primary opponent that announced on Twitter at 11:23 a.m. He might have announced earlier than that, except he was busy deleting all of his tweets for the previous 10 years. And then once the tweets were deleted, he announced on Twitter that he was going to challenge me in a primary. He didn't have a website, didn't have a rollout plan, didn't have a media plan, didn't have an interview set up. He just sent out a tweet. And so that seems to me that he hadn't been planning that very long. I think he got a phone call the night before that morning that said, you're going to have to announce now. That was January 9th. January 10th, the New York Times story came out. And the New York Times story that's been the subject of this turmoil here on the floor of the House that had the whole nation fixated on a few words. It actually turned out to be about 13 words. And it's still pretty stunning to think how you can mobilize the United States Congress over whether or not there's a hyphen or a period where it ought to be. But here's what we have, Mr. Speaker. We have to protect the Constitution of the United States. And the First Amendment of the Constitution is freedom of speech, religion, press, and a peaceable assembly. And freedom of speech, whatever our speech is, I know that I was sitting in a meeting with some folks in Europe about 2 or 3 years ago, and they're prosecuting people for what they call hate speech and for asking a rhetorical question. And I have a couple of friends over there that I happen to know that have been persecuted, prosecuted, and convicted for hate speech that was actually just a rhetorical question. And I was making the case to them. I said, you need American-style constitutional protection for freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of speech here in Europe, and you're going to be a lot more robust society, and you can address your problems and have open discussion, but you shut down any dialogue by hate speech prosecutions. And they said, we have more freedom of speech than you have in America. Now, that'll bring a person up short, Mr. Speaker. And so I asked why. And his answer was, In America, you can start a corporation, you can be a CEO, you can write a check to an unfavored not-for-profit group, or profit group, excuse me, and once the public finds out about that, then they put that out all over the internet, and they named the people that had lost their companies because of a tweet or because of a donation to an unpreferred entity. And as they made their case, I realized it kind of stumped me a little bit. We have freedom of speech in the Constitution, but they said they don't lock people up for hate speech. They just prosecute them, convict them, turn them loose, and they generally learn their lesson. But here, we've watched since that time back in this conversation took place in August 2018, freedom of speech has been diminished in this country incrementally. And it's a tragedy that we're going down that path. But here in this Congress, here's what happened. From the meeting that took place on the meeting that took place on the 8th of January, the announcement of one primary opponent on the 9th, the New York Times story on the 10th, and after that, there was nothing I could have said or done that was going to change the inertia that was created. They actually carried out what they'd given me the heads up they were going to do. They actually brought all media broadsides against me, and it didn't matter what was fact and what was fiction. It mattered that they had mobilized all those forces because they thought that they could force me to resign. And for what purpose? And I can give you a lot of reasons, Mr. Speaker, but I think what's better at this point to examine the New York Times. The New York Times interview took place on the 5th of January of 2019 on a phone call that I received from the reporter Trip Gabriel right about 8:30 in the morning. And I had advised him that he should go through my communications director, but I also had told him that I thought I would be open about 8:30 until 10:30 that day. So that he called me directly, and I had just gotten out of the shower to get ready to come down here and go to work. I didn't get a chance to check the email from my communications director first. That came in at 7:48 a.m., and it said, "Don't do the interview. It's a trap. I've been trying to shut this reporter down. I know he's coming at you with a trap. Don't do the interview." I didn't see that till much, much later. Had I seen that, there wouldn't have been an interview. But it was 56 minutes long, and there is no tape. And as far as I can determine, there aren't even any notes that are available to the public. And we have asked him, what was the question that you asked? What was the leading question? What was the context of the answer that I gave? And Kevin McCarthy is critical of me because he says that he can remember every word that he's used in the last 6 months in an interview, and that includes also the punctuation because that's the topic we were talking about. I don't think that's even humanly possible. I don't think anybody can do that. And Trip Gabriel says, don't worry about whether I'm accurate or not because I can type as fast as anybody can talk. Well, I've asked our wonderful stenographers down here how fast they can talk, how fast they can type. And what I learned was that about 130 words on a conventional keyboard is just about the limit to be certified, but maybe 250 or 60 on the Magic Keyboard that's going right down there right now. And I say, can you keep up with me when I'm talking at a fast pace? And they say, no, I have to listen to the tape. But I respect the professionalism we have here. Anybody can make a mistake. And then I ask about the precision of punctuation when you're doing a transcript on the keyboards even that we have here, let alone the conventional one that Trip Gabriel was using. And they'll say, well, we'll get the words right if you talk at a pace that we can keep up, but we can't guarantee the punctuation. And so there's a great big difference in whether the meaning of a phrase has got a hyphen in it or whether it's a comma in it. And Trip Gabriel put in a comma, and he insists he's right. And I would ask, how could he know? How could he know whether he's right or not? Because his memory is not any better than Kevin McCarthy, not as good as Kevin McCarthy says it is. And so, I want to go through this. So what happened shortly after that, this thing all hit, and on Monday of that early in the month of January, I had a meeting with our leader here, and it lasted about an hour. And it wasn't a happy meeting for either one of us. But he was determined, it was determined that I'm wrong, the New York Times is right, and I don't know how our leader can defend President Trump against the New York Times and attack me for the opposite. If you just Google lying New York Times, you get hundreds of hits on a Google of lying New York Times. Their credibility has been essentially destroyed, and this little piece, I would say this, 18 years in this Congress, 45 years in the construction business, 6 years in the Iowa Senate. Our family goes back 3 generations on the dirt that we're on right now, where we live. And throughout all that time, the New York Times and others have sent reporters into my neighborhood to try to find somebody that's got something derogatory to say about me or some insult to my character, and they have failed every time. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Huffington Post, you can name all of them. It used to be the Weekly Standard, and they rightfully are defunct now because of their overreach and their political bias that they rolled out. But in all that time, they've never found a single person, and no one has gone on record in this Congress in 18 years, serving on the Judiciary Committee for 16 of those years, and the most polarized committee on the Hill, and the most racially diverse committee on the Hill, and not one of those folks that many of them trade in the race issue has ever made a statement that I had been disrespectful or disparaging in any way whatsoever. And so there's no substance. I have no accusers. No individual accusers that have stood up, but this whole mass of people in this place were accusers on that day in early January of 2019. And so I'm here to assert that I'm asking this Congress and this congressional record to correct the record and to place a hyphen in the terms from that day where I said I was going to pause. I did pause. I've watched the videotape of it since then several times. But the language be white nationalist, white supremacist, hyphen. That's a pause, and it's a new thought. And the new thought then became Western civilization. Now, how did that language become offensive? Why did I sit in classes teaching me about the merits of our history and our civilization just to watch Western civilization become a derogatory term in political discourse today? The very statement itself refutes the New York Times characterization. It refutes the characterization that was delivered at me by Kevin McCarthy and others. It refutes the characterization that was the presumption of this Congress. But the presumption of this Congress didn't look at the evidence. They didn't look at the facts. They just got swept up in the herd mentality and went ahead and did what they did. And by the way, the resolution that was brought, I believe, by Mr. Clyburn that day, the resolution was actually honest because it said, whereas Congressman King has been quoted as saying, and that was a qualifier, and then they put the quote in out of the New York Times. Well, I was quoted as saying that. That was an honest statement. It was a misquote. They didn't bother saying that, but I was misquoted in the New York Times, but the way it was printed in the resolution was accurate. And all the other whereases that rejected the odious ideologies were all accurate. My own rejection of it in the previous week was stronger than the resolution itself. I wish they'd have used my language. Mine was stronger and mine was better, but I agreed with all the words that were in that, and I asked this body, vote yes on this resolution. I had, I'll say, dozens of friends here that were prepared to come to this floor and vote against that resolution in order to guard my back, just on the principle that they knew I'm not the person that that resolution implied that I am. But instead, rather than divide our conference, rather than divide this Congress, rather than ask them to vote against a resolution that happened to be technically true, I ask them all instead, vote for this resolution because it is technically true, and that's not the argument. Now, only one person voted against it. That was a gentleman from Illinois, Chicago, Bobby Rush. Former Black Panther voted against the resolution because he thought I should have been sanctioned or censured even more. Well, aren't we supposed to look at evidence in this place? Do facts matter? Does reason matter? Or are we just caught up in the political inertia of what goes on, and we try to fit ourselves into the stream so that we don't stand out very much? So I've given you some of that, but none of the context of my quote was included in the New York Times story. We called up Trip Gabriel and said, what question did you ask me? First they asked him, do you have a tape? He would not even answer the question of whether he had a tape. Then we asked him, what question did you ask Congressman King that brought forth this answer that's only about just a handful of words, 13 words altogether? And what's the context of that? What question was he answering? Did you feed those words to him, and did he repeat them back to you? And he wouldn't answer that question either. It took 2 phone calls to squeeze some out. But what we learned was he didn't expect that that would be the quote that would do it. That's almost an exact quote out of him. That he didn't think that that would be the quote. He thought it'd be something else in the article. So that indicates to me that he knew it was a hit job when he did the interview. And that is also what Mark Stein says. He says, that's not a good faith interview request. And this is said just the day after this incident. And Mark Stein went on to say, he said, he made a mistake, Steve King. He agreed to give an interview on national immigration policy to the New York Times. That's not a good faith interview request. They're only asking you, and he should know this, they're only asking you to stitch you up, to talk to you for 3 hours and get you to use one phrase in there that they can lift out and kill you with. Well, I think Mark Stein had that figured out, and I think he's really accurate. He went on to say, this guy, Steve King, was trapped. The words he said about when did that become controversial, he meant the phrase Western civilization. How come Mark Stein knows this the day after, and this Congress can't understand this 2 years after? He's not, and he went on to say, he's not a white supremacist, he's not a white nationalist, it's all stupid talk. So you've just surrendered the phrase, Western civilization. I don't get that, said Mark Stein. I don't see what's in it for conservatism in surrendering that phrase and accepting the left's view that the term Western civilization is beyond the pale. He also said that conservatives, Republicans, have trouble finding a hill that they believe is worth dying on. But when you sacrifice this issue and that issue and another issue, and you get to Western civilization and you sacrifice the hill of the very foundation of the first world, our country, and our founding of our country, the founding documents, the ideology that I would trace you all the way back to Moses and bring through the Greeks and the Romans in Western Europe and the rule of law and free enterprise capitalism and the Industrial Revolution and God-given liberty and natural law and the deep reading and understanding that was done by our founders who shaped this country, who found America to be and shaped America to be a giant petri dish for God-given liberty. Think of what it was like. Here is this land, this huge Western hemisphere that hadn't seen any aspect of what we consider to be modern life. And on this land, here came, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the idea, and it'll be Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, published 1776, same year the Declaration was published. And this petri dish, this giant petri dish of freedom and liberty and rule of law and unlimited natural resources, so we thought at the time, and the concept of manifest destiny and the wars that were fought to secure those things, all of that that is so rich in America's history and makes us the greatest nation the world has seen. But we can't defend Western civilization. And I'll say, 2 years ago when this came down, people didn't understand what's happening, but today, Western civilization is under assault, and I have been 100% correct on this. I've been more correct on this than I thought I was going to be, Mr. Speaker. But I would just want to add that nobody in America ever sat in a class to learn about the merits of white nationalism or white supremacism. And the content of that quote makes it clear. All the contemporaneous evidence supports what I've been saying. In fact, all the things that I have said since then, no one has found a hole in any of them. No one has said this is marginally untrue or untrue. No one's ever looked at the language that I've used and said that it isn't accurate. In fact, what I have done is I introduced a fact-check document, and that fact-check document was first published March 6, 2019. Kevin McCarthy gave me 24 hours to prove a negative. 24 hours. Oh, no, he didn't actually. I asked for 24 hours. He gave me 1 hour. Now, philosophers have, and everywhere from philosophers to barflies, have argued for centuries that it's impossible to prove a negative. Well, no, it's logically possible to prove a negative, and I did that. And I did it in a fact-check document filed in this Congress and published on my website February 3rd, March 6th of 2019, and then some other facts came to bear, and I published a follow-up of that. I deleted nothing from this. I just added some more facts, and that was published February 3rd of this year, 2020. And so some of the things that I want people to think about is we had done the LexisNexis search and asked it, has Steve King ever said white nationalist anywhere in history? We went back to the year 2000. That's about as far as we can trust the records, I think. And at no time, I had never, ever been quoted as ever even uttering the words that identify that odious ideology. And so when I was asked, what is a white nationalist, by Dave Price on a television station in Des Moines, Iowa, it caught me off guard because I hadn't been ever asked to define it before. I had never said the term before. In fact, I didn't use that term when I answered the question. But I did say it's a derogatory term. It might have meant something different 1, 2, or 3 years ago, but today it means racist. That was my definition off the cuff from a question that I didn't anticipate. Maybe it could have been a little more artful, but it's true. And it's true because the term has been weaponized and essentially unused. And so we looked through the record of LexisNexis and said, where's the first documented instance of where I ever used the phrase white nationalist? And that turns out to be in an interview that was done right before Christmas of 2018 with the Christian Science Monitor. And there I was making the case that some of this language has been weaponized. And I did use the terms, I said, I used the terms, if I can find it here, I added a couple of other terms that were part of that, such as, well, racist is weaponized, Nazi is weaponized, fascist is weaponized, white nationalism is weaponized, and white supremacy is weaponized. Now they're trying to weaponize Western civilization. When that happens, our civilization will be on its way out the door. But I was clearly making a statement defending Western civilization and rejecting the odious ideologies. So we looked it up, and I asked the question, just a minute. Okay. This, Mr. Speaker, is a chart of LexisNexis that charts the frequency of the utilization of the term white nationalist or white nationalism, a derivative of that. And so it goes back to the year 2000, and you can see all the way up till 2015, it's virtually unused. It wasn't in our American vernacular. No one could be expected to have the precise and perfect definition for that in their head from a I'll say, a quick response type of a question, if we're not using it in our language. It wasn't in our political discourse. It may be in academia a bit. That's probably where 100 to 200 times a year is about what that is down on the bottom. And then you see that 2015 it picked up just a little bit, but 2016 it went from virtually unused to 10,000 times a year. And then in 2017 it went to 30,000 times a year. 2018 it's still up there at 20,000 times a year. This term, white nationalism, was weaponized, and it was used against conservatives. They knew they'd worn out the term racism, so they had to come up with some new terms, and that was one of them. Here is another example. This is the year 2016. It was, I could say, almost virtually unused up until November of 2016. And what happened in November of 2016? Oh, Donald Trump was elected president, wasn't he, on about the 8th of November. And the following Sunday, about the 12th or 13th of November, the top people in the Democratic Party met at the Mandarin Hotel here in Washington, D.C. The articles that I read about it are the articles that are written around their star person there, George Soros, who was in that hotel and presumably led some of the discussions that were there and contributed likely to the cause. And so from the moment that they went into that hotel that Sunday, it doesn't really show very much utilization of it, but on the following day, Monday, it shoots off the charts. There's no question that this synchronizes almost exactly with the meeting in the Mandarin Hotel, which I believe strategically decided we're going to launch white nationalism and white supremacy as weaponized terms, and we're going to use them against Republicans. So this is actually, Mr. Speaker, this is actually the picture of November itself and broken down day by day. And so you can see the 11th, the 12th, here's the 13th. That was Monday. They called into the hotel. 13th is Sunday, excuse me. And so they were checking in, but on Monday, here we go, Tuesday, that's how they triggered the weaponization of language. And that's what I was describing in that interview, although I thought I was right because my guts were speaking to me, my instincts were speaking to me. I didn't have the data, but it's pretty clear that I was more right than I imagined that I would be. That's the circumstances that we're dealing with here, and the hyperactivity of a planned ambush of a member of Congress in an effort to try to drive him out of office and force him to resign based upon false stories and false allegations without substance. So I'll take you to this. We went to Congressional Research Services, CRS, and asked them, who's been removed from all of their committees, presumably for disciplinary reasons? And what do you know about, as far as you can go back in the search engine or into modern history? And we found out that, let's see, James Traficant was removed from all of his committees. He was subsequently convicted of federal felony and went to prison, several federal felonies as a matter of fact. Then we've had, let's see, I can think of 2, 3 cases since that time, fairly contemporary. I don't want to say their names because I remain a person who, well, I regret what they were convicted of, but nonetheless it's this. There have been 5 people, 5 members of Congress who were removed from their committees for disciplinary reasons in all of modern history, according to CRS. One of them is fairly recent down in Kansas. And the other 2, in addition to James Traficant, were subsequently convicted of federal felonies. So, and the charges on the Kansas issue are federal felonies. So here I stand, the sole person in 233 years of the American Republic who has been denied a full-throated representation of his 750,000 constituents by an arbitrary decision of the leader of the Republican Party who had no evidence except his faith that the dishonest reporter of the New York Times was more honest than the very honest member of Congress standing before him. No one in this Congress has ever asserted that I misinformed them willfully. I maybe made a couple of mistakes on data, and if I caught them, I went back and fixed it as quick as I could. But that assertion has never been made. Has never been made of any personal, there's been any personal disparagement, as I said earlier. All of that holds together. No one in this body has ever heard me utter even a swear word under my breath. And yet this is what happens to the freedom of speech and representation. And I would add this. I had more votes for me in the previous election in November of 2018 than either the current leader of the Republican Party or the conference chair. And yet they've got a sanctimonious attitude about what's right and what's wrong. And so I would assert, Mr. Speaker, that the congressional record did err. It's easy to determine that because there's a C-SPAN tape. We have a tape of one thing, and that was the distinct difference between the 2 odious ideologies and Western civilization. I made the point, I did the pause. It's natural for me to talk and think that way. It's not natural for me to advocate for something that I disagree with. And further, this fact-check document makes it real clear that all of the time that it's been out here, a year and a half or better, not a soul has found anything false in it, anything mischaracterized, anything biased, or any hole in the logic that says that could not have happened with the New York Times. It's a false and erroneous misquote is the nicest way that I can put that. And Then, let's see. Mr. Speaker, I've gone through a number of these things that are the factual components of it, but here's another piece. How often was white nationalists used in this Congress? I said it was virtually unused for all those years on up until 2018. Well, we went back through the congressional record and did a search too. And I will just read you the text of this fact-check document to give you some of the flavor of it. It says, another indicator of the recent weaponization of the phrase white nationalism can be found in a study, the congressional record, a congressional record according to CRS. No member of Congress has ever said in their original words the term white nationalist on the House floor prior to President Donald Trump being elected. That's out of a CRS report. And so how could it be that, that's attributed to me, and there's a thought process that's attributed to me, but it says Kevin McCarthy's decision to remove King from all three of his committees for a misquote in the New York Times is unprecedented, with no analogous case to mine, and apart from party switches, level of party support, King is the only the fourth member in Congress history, that's this report prior to the Kansas incident I mentioned, according to CRS, to be stripped of all committee assignments, and he's the only one who was removed from committees for a reason that has no basis in history, in House or conference rules, or federal law, or I'll say no basis in truth either. And so one has to come to a conclusion here as to what actually happened. And you can believe the version of events that are relied upon by Kevin McCarthy to strip King of committee assignments. But if that's so, one must believe that an unreasonable but sensational interpretation for which no evidence exists is more likely to be accurate than a reasonable, non-controversial interpretation which is internally supported by context clues and externally supported by data and other contemporaneous published accounts. One must also believe that the New York Times, which is a hostile liberal paper, which has had other articles about me, Steve King, written by the same author, thoroughly debunked as completely bogus, set aside its animus in this particular case, and wrote an objective article for the first time on me. This document that I'm speaking from contains hyperlinks to source material. Parties interested in reviewing this can go to my website, steveking.house.gov, and pull one of these documents down. But, Mr. Speaker, another piece of this was Brit Hume, legendary journalist and a reporter. Brit Hume, publicly no fan of Steve King, but he read through an article that was written by Tripp Gabriel just about on January 15th of 2019, and Tripp Gabriel brought up a whole series of quotes that said, proves that I'm the racist. And Brit Hume read down through that, and he said it's bogus. It's completely bogus. Most of the articles, most of the quotes don't have anything to do with race whatsoever, and none of the comments were racist. That's Brit Hume. And between Brit Hume and Mark Stein and multiple others who are objective, I think we get the idea of what happened here. And what I regret is going home to spend time with my grandchildren is not what I regret, Mr. Speaker. But what I regret is the precedent that's established here, that there's no place to appeal. And I recall when I was first elected to the Iowa Senate, I had what turned out to be a future constituent who found himself in an administrative law judge position where the administrative law judges had ruled against him. It was a domestic issue. And I knew that he was honest, and I knew that he was the target, and I knew he was the victim of a stack of lies. So I set about trying to get him an appeal so that his case could be heard. And as I checked the fences, so to speak, as we say in Iowa, or perhaps Texas as well, as we checked the fences, you'd always, well, we'll go on to the next one, the next one, the next one. But once you went around, it was a corral. And there was no way for him, he's back appealing to the very person who ruled against him in the first place. Now, so what you're really down to is you can go through some motions, but you have to ask the decider to change their mind. That's the only appeal. And when you've got the pressure of a nation, the media pressure, the political politics that go on here, then they're not going to change their mind. There's too much narcissism involved for that. And by the way, there's a significant amount of mendacity while we're talking about personal characteristics, because Kevin McCarthy promised me that he would go to the rules or to the steering committee and ask them to restore me to all of my committees. That happened April 19th of this year. I have the transcript of that phone call, and yet when McCarthy was asked about that in a press conference, he denied it and made me out to be the liar. That's another piece that's got to be changed in the history of all of this. But what I regret is, if there's a due process, there needs to be a place where there can be an appeal. And there needs to be a place to roll the facts out. And there needs to be a way that you can put people to sit in judgment that actually have to evaluate the facts and be subjected to criticism for their decision that they would make. None of that exists in this Congress. It may exist over on the other side of the aisle. It doesn't exist on this side of the aisle. And so, you know, I have my obligations here, and one of the obligations is to deliver the truth. And I'm confident everything I've said here today is objectively true. It's what I've dug through this for a good long period of time. When after the primary election, I sat down on my deck out on the east side before the sun came up in the morning, and took my keyboard and began to type. And after a few weeks, I had 60-some thousand words, and that's a book, and that'll be in print real soon. And the title of that is Walking Through the Fire. I was able to call Andrew Breitbart a close personal friend. And when he tragically passed away at age 43 several years ago, I was given the honor to give the eulogy for him at the National Memorial here in Washington, D.C. for Andrew Breitbart, whose imprint is on our society to this day. But you know, Andrew, he would say to us, walk towards the fire. Walk towards the fire. Their bullets aren't real. They just want to get you to, they want to scare you. They want to shut you up. They don't like your ideology, and so they'll attack you personally, and they'll call you a whole series of names. He was more eloquent about that than I made, but I started out the book that way, Walk Towards the Fire. But the title of my book is Walking Through the Fire, because once that fire was lit in front of me, I could have either turned and run or walked through it. And I said, if you're going to do this to me, you're going to have to shoot me down in the middle of Main Street at high noon, and with everybody watching. And that's pretty much what happened. And they mounted that kind of effort and did everything they could to destroy my reputation. But facts stand the same. I have no accusers. All of the logic of this fact-check document supports what I've told you here today, Mr. Speaker. All of it. There's not a hole in it. No one has found a hole in it, even when it would behoove them to find a hole in it or several holes in it. And I think that my reputation here among the people that know me is solid. But also I'm going to have a shorter list of friends' maintenance after this last experience over these 2 years. I don't regret going home. I don't regret spending more time with my grandchildren. I got a phone call from one of our county chairs here a month and a half or so ago, and he said, I'm calling to tell you that God has shown you how much he loves you, because he's guaranteeing you more time. He's sending you home to spend more time with your grandchildren. That's a good a way to put that as you can. And I've made good friends here in this place, but the list of them is shorter than I thought it was. And so I think it's very important that people coming into this Congress, the freshmen whom I've never gotten the chance to know over a 2-year period of time, because if they're seen talking to Steve King, the leader might not give them the committee assignment that they want. I didn't get to know them. That's too bad. I'm sure there's good people there. But that list is shorter than I thought it would be. And we need more and deeper character in this Congress. And we need to tie back to facts and policy. And what I've seen happen here in the time that I've been in this Congress is when young members come in, they come in pretty strong ideologically for the most part. And they want to make a difference. And they want to pass legislation, and they're policy people and they're ideological people. And I meet them and I like them and I like the spark that's in their eyes. But pretty quick, sometimes there's even 1 or 2 or 3 even on the first day that decide mine's going to be a political equation. Over time, they give up on the policy, they give up on the ideology, they find out that their job is to either work for this team or work for this team over here. And they slowly become a political barometer. And when an issue comes up in front of them and they have to make a decision, the question will be, how does this help me? And if it doesn't help them, then that question is, how do I avoid dealing with this issue? I came here to correct the wrongs that I had seen in life, to fix the injustices. And I didn't anticipate that I'd see them so starkly in front of me. But I have. And so I wanted to come to the floor here today, Mr. Speaker, and let you know some of these things that I'm thinking about. And hopefully this body will learn from the experiences that we've all been part of here. The freshmen need to be thinking about this, have an independent voice. I have said that one of the ways that you can have an independent voice here in this Congress, and perhaps the only way you can have an independent voice, is you have to have constituents that will support you. You have to have a fundraising network that is independent from the people that can take it away from you. And you have to have a national media voice so that the truth restrains the people that want to undercut you. And there's a major component that I left out of my presentation here, Mr. Speaker, and that is, I'm a member of Congress from Iowa. I'm the dean of the Iowa congressional delegation. I've been engaged in the First in the Nation Iowa caucus for a long time. And I'm the only member that I know of at this level, this elected level, that's ever made an endorsement of a presidential candidate and taken all the heat from the other candidates that comes from that. But I think it's important to do that. I have had, along with just a handful of other people, an extraordinary opportunity to get to know these presidential candidates one-on-one. 17 of them the last time. I brought 12 of them into a Freedom Summit down in Des Moines to launch the national presidential race. I put 1,250 people in the seats and standing room only. They were rock-ribbed, principled, full-spectrum, constitutional Christian conservatives. And when they heard something they liked, they stood, stomped their feet, and applauded and cheered. When I heard something they didn't like, they might look at their watch, boo, hiss, or walk away. They were sorting these candidates and matching up with what they believed in. The conservatives did well that day, but the moderates didn't do so well, and a couple of moderates didn't show up. And so when I see that, when the moderates don't show up and the conservatives do show up, and let's see, Walker got a big bounce out of that day. Donald Trump got a big bounce. Ted Cruz got a big bounce. Ben Carson got a big bounce that day. They all spoke at the Freedom Summit. And that helped launch them into a very competitive presidential campaign. And then I did everything I could to provide access to the candidates so that they could be in Iowa and meeting these caucus goers and shaking hands and doing the things necessary to have a chance at the nomination. That functions really well. But what we did, we built the platform around that. And the platform for the presidential candidates was actually built in Iowa. And then we put 3 or 4 of those candidates on that platform once they come out of the Iowa caucus, and we send them off to New Hampshire. New Hampshire does pretty good, but sometimes they'll pull a nail or two out. And then they'll take that platform and send those candidates down to South Carolina, and thankfully they put a lot of those nails back in. And so by the time you're done with South Carolina, the platform for the nominees is settled. And that's the platform that makes it to the National Convention. That's the platform that arrives in the Oval Office. That's the platform that exists there today. And when I walk into the Oval Office, I look around and I think, my gosh, we really did accomplish this. We accomplished the agenda on immigration, for example. And we accomplished the agenda to repeal Obamacare. We didn't get it all done, but it's on there. I have in my pocket a picture of all the promises that Donald Trump made. There's a lot of check marks behind the ones that have been accomplished. Those promises, many of them were made in Iowa at the launch of this. And that's one of the things that has brought out the opposition. The establishment people in this country don't want conservatives to have a loud voice on who the nominees are going to be. But I say, the heart of the heartland is where the families are. It's where the small businesses are, where we're the furthest away from the big businesses. We're insulated from that. And so our ideology, Democrat and Republican, is closer to the real people than you might find if you go someplace where there's an expensive media market. We must have launching Democrat and Republican candidates, we must have that hands-on, where they have to meet people and get to know the American people. We want real candidates out there on that stage. And the folks that had the money, for example, Jeb Bush spent $139 million, and he got something like 3 or 5 delegates. He's not very happy with how that opportunity didn't exist for him in a way that it might have for a Ted Cruz, a Ben Carson, a Donald Trump, or a Scott Walker. And so they decided that they don't want to have that voice in Northwest Iowa, and that's a big piece of this as well. So, Mr. Speaker, the forces behind this, the forces of the swamp that have mobilized themselves like never before and pulled off something that had never been accomplished before, and done with, I'll say, a strategy and millions of dollars and a network of media that was coordinated across this country, is all part of this. It's all part of my book. I can't begin to express it all here in the time that I have, but I do appreciate the time that I've been allowed here on the floor of the House of Representatives. And Mr. Speaker, I want you to know that I appreciate serving with you, a man of a happy attitude that expresses it across the aisles in a bipartisan way. And so I urge this Congress to take a look at the C-SPAN tape, correct the congressional record, put the hyphen in where it belongs, and recognize that I've been right on this all along. No one's found a hole in anything that I've said. You can look through every word that I put out through the last 2 years, and everything I've said stands up. It doesn't stand up with the New York Times. It doesn't stand up with Kevin McCarthy. It stands up when I say it, and I make that point as I step aside here because it's a challenge. Show me where I'm wrong. Show me where I've been, I'd say where I haven't been factual. No one has been able to do that. They won't be able to do that. The fact-check document stands on its own. It's completely logical, and it proves a negative, even though the philosophers had long said that's not possible to do. So appreciate being recognized here to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I yield back the balance of my time.